Otherwise, maybe I can start. Just, I think what we have seen today, I think, is 3 projects, 3 activities, a different, I think, on the spectrum both of time, because I think the CAMD is the one that is a little bit more mature. It's been going on already for 5 years. Then we have the Pharmacoc project that has been going on for 3 years. And then we have AMIS that kick off the activity 1 month ago, Simon, isn't it? Yeah. So it's a spectrum, and I think what is important is also the opportunity, of course, for the younger project to take advantage of the learning and what the other projects have already or work out. But I think now I would like actually to ask also Jean-Georges to make some comment on this. Also, if you think, I mean, of course, the buzzword today has been biomarker. And we can see really that the different projects work on a different spectrum, I think, along the use of this biomarker. So we have, of course, the CAMD focus, very focused on let's get this biomarker accepted by the regulators. Then we have the Pharmacoc that will work more in the early stage, but also in the, let's say, how we have the tools. Then once we have this biomarker, we need also the models to discover the new drugs. And then, of course, we have the AMIF that should then go to the real world. And I think this is also really important. What is really important, and was also important come out from the discussion of this morning, was we really want to go now to real life results and real life, so to the patient. So, Jean-Georges, what do you think would be important, really? Because now, really, if all these beautiful tools are there, they should be used for using in real life setting. That means that to be accepted by the patient, isn't it?
That's quite a big ask, or a big question that you're asking me. And what I wanted to talk to you about as well is the kind of input that patient organizations can give to this whole process. And I have to say we're very lucky that we're involved in the Pharmacoc project, we're involved in the EMIF project. When EMA develops new guidelines or so on, they actually ask us for our opinion. So we're really quite fortunate that in all of these kind of issues we are asked to provide our input. I think the role that patient organizations can really play in this kind of field is, first of all, dissemination. We can provide information about the successes, the failures of these kind of projects to the kind of audience that we represent. So we can present that to the patient organizations. In our case, we have 34 national member organizations from 31 European countries. We're able to kind of play a kind of multiplier for the kind of results that you're producing. But I also think it's very important that we can provide what you talk about, real-life data to a lot of these kind of projects. I think as an organization, as a European organization, we've carried out a number of surveys of what is important to patients, what is important to carers when it comes to looking after a person with Alzheimer's disease. And for example, one of the big surveys that we carried out in a number of European countries asked carers to rate the kind of symptoms that patients present with, and to rate those symptoms that were most difficult for them to cope with. And in a way, cognition, which is the kind of holy grail of Alzheimer's disease research, was not anywhere near the top 3 kind of key symptoms that carers reported as the most important for them and the most difficult for them. So what they really reported was that activities of daily living was something that they found very difficult to deal with, and behavioral problems, agitation, aggression, wandering as a kind of other issues that they found the most difficult in a way to deal with. So I really think that's another area that we can support these kind of initiatives. And I think last and in no way least, and it's something that hasn't really been discussed yet, is that we can provide a kind of a societal case for a lot of the kind of research that's been carried out. And I think Jill was, we invited Jill and yourself to present data at a meeting that we organized in the European Parliament. So really to kind of give a backing and report to policymakers about the importance of these kind of research projects that are being conducted. And from our point of view, like the data that we are using ourselves is we're talking about 7.3 million Europeans that currently have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Behind those 7.3 million people, there's additional carers, family members, children, grandchildren that are affected by this disease. We know that as the disease progresses, the time that carers spend caring for the person with dementia increases. 20% of carers spend more than 10 hours a day caring for the person with dementia. That goes up to 50% of carers in the later stages. I think other data that we looked at, this was a kind of survey where we really looked at how perceptions are different between the different sides of the Atlantic. So we tried to see whether there are big differences between the perceptions in the US and the perceptions in Europe. And what we found, there was really a lot of harmony in a way between the two sides of the Atlantic. People were aware what Alzheimer's disease was. Between almost 40% of people, between 60 and 70% of people from the general public knew somebody with Alzheimer's disease. So that's a very high proportion. And between 25% and 42% of people had a family member with Alzheimer's disease in their family. And you can imagine that as societies are aging, all of us are probably very likely to either have already now a member in our family that has that disease or will have that a family member in the future. So from my point of view, also this kind of cross-Atlantic kind of collaboration is really fantastic to see that. IMI is now collaborating with the critical path. I think that's very important. FDA and EMA are collaborating, and I think from a kind of patient's perspective, it's really time as well that we in Alzheimer Europe and our national organizations collaborate much more closely with the Alzheimer's Association in the US, because I think we can really learn an awful lot from each other. And for me, this is really kind of a very exciting new development, this kind of cross and willingness to collaborate across borders, across oceans. And just earlier this week, I was at the European Parliament, where the Global CEO Alliance Against Alzheimer's Disease was launched in the European Parliament. And again, it's a kind of cross-Atlantic collaboration of top CEOs from top companies that really believe that dementia is a high priority, and I think it's fantastic to see all these kind of research initiatives going on at the moment.
Thank you very much, and hopefully we have Maria Carrillo on the line. Maybe like also to comment?
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's very exciting to hear about all of these projects going on, and I wish I could have been with you in person. From a patient advocacy group, I basically echo everything that Jean-Georges has said. We at the Alzheimer's Association probably parallel much of what Jean-Georges' interests are, and our patient advocacy constituents obviously are in the United States. However, we are also extremely interested in any way we can be of assistance on the standardization and also a data repository side. We ourselves are funders of quite a bit of research as the largest private funder of Alzheimer's in the United States. And so we have been fairly involved in some of the work on standardization as well as collection of open source data. So we continue to have conversations with CAMD, try to help wherever we can in terms of ensuring that if our convening efforts or perhaps even funding efforts will help in any way, we are certainly always ready to talk about those options. One last thing I will say, so that we can get to panel discussions and questions, is that we are extremely excited to continue to talk to EMIS and IMI. We've had some preliminary discussions with EMIS via some of its leadership, including Simon Lovestone, who spoke very eloquently about what they were trying to accomplish. And so we are very, very interested to see how this evolves and how we can learn from what EMIS is doing, as well as try to even take advantage of what they have already accomplished in order to see if that can be replicated elsewhere, and also see if we can tap their data sets, because that is indeed a rich resource just waiting to be mined. So really looking forward to how this develops. We just lastly want to say that we are really pleased to continue to work with CAND efforts on qualifying biomarkers in the U.S. With the help of course, Dr. Katz and others at the FDA. And we are really looking forward to continuing those efforts and hope that we can have qualification for both CSF and hippocampal volume within the U.S. soon, as Maria Isaac has described has already happened in Europe. So thank you very much again for allowing me to listen to this fantastic discussion and inviting me to this. So that will be it for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we have the question again on the screen, please, so that everybody can see them? And well, then we come and go. And then I think now if maybe we can ask again also to our regulator that is online to comment on what he sees as a real regulatory impact of all this effort, and where there should be further focus for getting really to the maximum possible impact and really the harmonization of effort, since resources, everybody knows, are scarce and we really have to work together. So if Russel Katz can have a comment on this, that would be nice.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes. Perfect. We can see you also.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. A couple of comments. First of all, we completely endorse any efforts to share data. We think that's critical. The idea of patient health records being able to be utilized for research and to be able to share that data or accumulate data in that way across multiple countries is extraordinary. It should be extraordinarily helpful. We endorse anything like that. In addition, of course, we've been very interested and involved in the ADNI initiative. So any effort to share data, I think, is critical. I have a couple of comments about the several statements that have been made about getting regulators to accept the biomarkers. So I just want to comment on that a little bit, just to clarify our position about that. There are many, definitions of the term accept. The use of biomarkers based on animal data to choose agents to go into clinical trials is not, strictly speaking, under the purview of the FDA, although we endorse it entirely as a rational basis to choose drugs. But it's not really within our authority to really rule on that sort of use. We do, of course, have great interest in the use of biomarkers in clinical trials. In some sense, we accept a whole range of biomarkers in clinical trials when they are used to identify populations. We heard about trying to identify homogeneous populations. So the use of biomarkers in clinical trials to identify patients, enroll patients with different characteristics, we endorse that heartily, and it's being done, of course. The use of hippocampal volume and CSF biochemistry has not. We don't have an official acceptance under the biomarker qualification team, but as you heard from several speakers, that effort is ongoing. So even though we haven't ruled on that from that perspective, we endorse sponsors to use those biomarkers routinely in identifying clinical trial patients. So that's that. As far as utilizing biomarkers as outcome measures, we have recently issued a draft guidance on developing drugs for patients with very early Alzheimer's disease. And we do mention in that guidance, as we have been saying to sponsors for quite some time, that changes in biomarkers in conjunction with clinical outcomes might serve as the basis for approving a treatment as a disease modifier. I say might because we have not gotten to the point where we've seen an application that does that, but that's something that we are willing to entertain. I think that guidance also says, and we've been saying publicly for a very long time, that the use of a biomarker by itself for purposes of approval, we don't think that we're there yet. Which brings me to another issue, which has to do with accelerated approval and approving drugs on the basis of an effect on a biomarker alone. I was very excited to see the matrix approach of the Pharmacog initiative in terms of multiple biomarkers in animal models. I think that's probably the way of the future, and I think it's critical. I think the animal models of that sort might ultimately someday be very useful for supporting a biomarker or a group of biomarkers as being the basis for an accelerated approval. I absolutely do not think we are there yet, and people shouldn't interpret these remarks to think that we think we are, but they could be useful to support the use of biomarkers, particularly as they might help to elucidate the mechanism of disease. Let me just close with making a comment that I've made many times and I think is very important. The matrix model begs the question of what are we doing about combination therapies and looking at the use of combination therapies in animal models. If there are multiple pathways involved, it just sort of screams for the use of combination treatments in animal models in particular, which is something that has rarely been used. One final point that I'd like to make. If the question is, well, what are the gaps and where do we go now? One issue that strikes me is that one of the big gaps to me is that although there's been a great deal of data sharing, particularly in ADNI and other initiatives, I don't believe we've gone very far in the idea of sharing on-treatment data. There's been a lot of sharing of placebo data, which is great, but I don't think it goes far enough. And the idea of early combination therapy and sponsors sharing very early information on their novel compounds, as well as sharing data on the on-treatment arms of various trials, in particular trials that have failed, I think would go a great deal towards learning a lot more about disease mechanism and the design of future trials. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On this point of the involvement of regulator, Maria, you gave already some answer in your presentation, but do you still have some comment after Dr. Katz?
Yeah, I agree with Rusty then. But we are working, and actually this will be a question, and I already asked George to help us with this, is that trying to see what happened with treatment, really, how these drugs really affect basically cognition and biomarkers, and trying to see if this can be really a future, if the patients there will be confidence, if something like this can be, they found that they have confidence enough to have it there, that they can be used, and how they feel about the effect and all of that. Then I think that needs to be put to patients, and they can also give us the feedback. Then we have in plan to do something like that. The companies are happy to come and put something like that forward with patients, and it will be both sides of the Atlantic, by the way.
Hi, Russell. It's Jill Richardson here. I don't know if you can see me. Yeah, in answer to your question around combination approaches, I think for Alzheimer's we're way behind. I mean, this is very much being considered for other disease areas such as multiple sclerosis, where we know you've already got an agent that's precedented in terms of an immunomodulatory agent. So it's much easier to design the studies to show beneficial effect of, say, something like a remyelinating agent. Whereas for Alzheimer's, there's no precedented disease modifier. So to sort of design the clinical study to show that there's an increase in effect when you've got two unknowns, I think is very complex. And until we get, as I say, this biomarker matrix, but perhaps help us predict which of those are going to give the efficacy, I think, it's going to be a huge investment up front to go into those combination studies.
No doubt. But again, as I understand the matrix model, you're looking at biomarkers that might reflect dysfunction or ultimately treatment response in multiple pathways. And again, that just begs the question about treatments, combinations of treatments that are directed to those various pathways. And whether it's disease modification or whether it's just symptomatic treatment, it's just sort of the obvious question that leaps off the page. I agree. Studies can be complicated, particularly if they would be required to show a contribution of each of the components. You know, we have a rule that says you have to do that, but I have to tell you, if there were a combination of treatments that markedly improved or clearly slowed the progress of Alzheimer's disease, there's always ways to negotiate how to meet the requirement for showing an effect of each component. Certainly, at least you might think in animal models it would be a place to start to see if combination treatments are useful or even better than the individual components. I just think it's the obvious question, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of work being done in that area.
I agree. I think we just have to take a step backwards, because the multidimensional matrix is looking at a combination of different pharmacodynamic, sort of physiological, biochemical, and so on endpoints. And you have to ask the question, first of all, for a singular mechanism, if you inhibit that mechanism, what does it do on that matrix? Before you can say, what does a multiple approach in terms of hitting all the mechanisms do on the multiple? Do you know what I mean? So you need to break it down into stepwise approaches before you can start taking on the combination approach, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, one of the questions that I think is also and come also really from the discussion that we had in our very productive and intense workshop yesterday is really the importance to be able to share data, and also we have also quite hard discussion on data standardization and also the different level. So I think maybe Simon and Diana want to say something about this.
After you.
Lady first.
I'll just say one of the highlights that emerged from yesterday's very dynamic discussion was that all three consortia said, perhaps if we all approach the industry with the same request, which is to share data from clinical trials. Now we've heard the importance of active treatment arms. That would be more dynamic than each one asking, and clearly we have been asking. So one of the things that we've heard this morning is, how can the patients help us? And I want to say that one of the main challenges we face when we ask this question about sharing data from industry trials is the lack of informed consent. So the patients who consent with the trials agree to share consent for that trial, and that is it. So there's tremendous enthusiasm now for this idea of developing universal informed consents. And the patients do want to have the efforts and all what they go through in a trial benefit the field, but that hasn't happened legally. So I just bring that up in this venue because we're all saying, let's identify the hurdles and then figure out how patients can help us get through that.
So it's critically important, and I couldn't agree more that we need not only to get the data from placebo arm, but we need to get data from treatment arm. But I think there are a number of obstacles to data sharing that are surmountable, but we need to pay attention to them. So first, we need to have data standards, and we need to be able to map our data onto each other. And CAMD and colleagues in the US are doing fantastic work with that. We're not going to reinvent that wheel. We're just going to use what you've already done, Diane. So that's a surmountable problem. Then we need a IT solution, as it were, the space to be able to do it. I think that's the easiest of all the problems, but we're certainly going to tackle that. But the most important problem to overcome is the human problem, getting people to agree to share their data. So I think that it's worthwhile to break that down into sharing of data amongst academic groups and then sharing of data amongst the pharma studies that we've just heard about, both the placebo and the treatment arm. So what EMIF is going to do is to operate with a federated model. So we think that for us, that is the best way forward. And having a federated model means that you only actually share the data for a specific study using your own rules of engagement, and you maintain your sense of ownership, actual ownership over this data set. We think that is the way for academic groups to be able to share data in a more collaborative and open way than often happens up to now. Actually, it's already happening. So ADNI and AdNeuromed have shared data for years now with a series of papers published, but we want to widen that sharing to all of the studies, including pharmacog. I think for pharma, and this is a purely personal, not an EMIF view, I think for pharma, in order to make that work, it seems to me that we have to move to a situation where pharma are going to get more value and see more opportunities for them in sharing than in not sharing. So I think that there might be a push and a pull thing for that. And the push thing must surely come from the regulators to try and push pharma to do that. The pull thing might just come when we demonstrate the value. So we might have to do it a few times, demonstrate that by actually doing it, we get real value and we can move the drug discovery process forward. And maybe I'm an unrealist or an optimist, but I just think once that's happened once or twice, it will be, I hope, a snowball effect, and we'll see that more and more often. So I'm looking for an opportunity for us to persuade pharma, perhaps in EMIF, to share data, including treatment arm data, and demonstrate that it makes a tangible advantage to them. Once we can demonstrate a tangible advantage, I just think it will become easier.
Thank you very much, Jean-Georges.
Maybe just to address the point, if somebody asked me to help, I think it's very important that we respond in a way to the challenge that you just posed. And at the moment here in Europe, there are two big legislations that are being discussed. One is the Data Protection Directive, and the other one is the Clinical Trial Directive. So both of these are huge pieces of legislation that affect, in a way, the whole discussions that we're having here on what kind of data should be used, how clinical trials should be organized, how difficult or how easy should it become for people to be able to start clinical trials in a number of European countries at the same time. And we've really been trying to suggest a very similar route to the one that you're mentioning, which is that in a way scientists should be encouraged to ask people not just for a very detailed clinical informed consent for one specific issue, but really to have this kind of global consent that the data that patients are giving in a way to research that can be used again and again for other purposes as well. Of course, we also fully endorse issues around anonymization of data, which is very important. So I think that's part of the discussions, but I really think that as pharmaceutical companies, as academia and patient organizations, we really have a kind of common fight that we should be fighting. And just one issue as well around the kind of issue around sharing of data. My organization, when we started in our kind of policy kind of work, we adopted what we call the Paris Declaration, which was really make dementia a European priority, increase research funding, but much more importantly, don't just increase the funding, but better coordinate the funding between countries, between stakeholders and so on. And there's one big initiative that's also happening at the moment, which is the joint program on neurodegeneration. And I'm just wondering whether there are representatives from that program that are here, whether there are any kind of networks that are being built with the kind of joint programming to see, because they are doing work on biomarkers, and I think they would be a very important stakeholder to have around the table for these discussions as well.
Okay. Please, some questions.
I had a brief question. Maybe as a clinical researcher who's actually obtaining informed consent, I wouldn't underestimate the questions you get from patients. What is actually happening with the data? I don't think it's just a matter of saying that in the informed consent, because you may lose patients. So I think the standardization is probably the more productive route, because then your data will be meta-analyzable and you don't need to have that level of individualized patient data. But as a clinician investigator, I think the patients are fully aware and should be aware that they own the data, nobody else. So eventually, I think that's a cultural matter. But we've seen patients decline informed consent based on the fact that this will be handled according to another country's regulations. And now think about the clinical practice. Neither the clinician nor the patient will know what that entails in the usual setting. So I think the standardization is the first step, and thinking of international research from the get-go. If you design your trial to include many countries, then you'll circumvent this problem, I think.
Claudio?
I'm Claudio Babiloni from University of Rome Sapienza. I'm an enthusiastic researcher involved in pharmaco project. My point for my contribution to this very nice discussion is about the issue of standardization of the procedure to extract markers from the data, because the projects we are discussing today focus on the standardization and the systematic collection of data of different projects, or in the availability of Europe, USA, and so on. But another point is to a step forward on the procedures, the standardized procedures to extract markers from neuroimaging, neurophysiology, but also biological stuff. So my suggestion is to develop aspects of MPhil CAMD projects on the procedure to extract markers.
Thank you, Claudio. That's an excellent comment. And in CMD, I didn't have time to highlight today in the presentation of how closely we work with the Alzheimer's Association. Maria Carrillo mentioned today her alliances and her leadership in global standardization of biomarkers, and Giovanni Forsoni and others. In our work, and as was highlighted this morning, the challenges of implementing the biomarkers globally for clinical trials is because there isn't standardization of assays, defined cut points, and common methodology. The work that's being led through the Alzheimer's Association at Maria's leadership, the Global Biomarker Standardization Consortium for CSF, the hippocampal harmonization effort, and now a newer effort on amyloid PET standardization is key. For us in a public-private partnership as one, it's that alliance and having the close partnership with the Alzheimer's Association has saved us resources in owning that through the regulatory path. And I think for novel biomarkers, particularly in combinations where there are even more challenges for harmonization, standardization, having that integrated approach and networking through worldwide ADNI and other initiatives is going to be key for implementing these biomarkers, whether it be for patient enrichment or for outcomes as pharmacodynamic measures. Great point.
Thank you. And we have a question there. Can you please?
Walter Luijten from KU Leuven. So in terms of data sharing, I hear a lot of support for the idea, but I have two suggestions. One would be that IMI may perhaps set the example by sharing the data that they have collected in the context of some consortia that they have financed and that are now available, but only within that consortium. So I think if it could be shared more broadly, that would definitely be an advantage. The work is already paid for, and the data could be very useful to other people who have very good ideas that may not have occurred to someone within the consortium. In terms of access to patient records, I think that the regulations in Europe are very different. Also, the way people view it. If you look at the UK, for instance, where there's been a government decision announced by the Prime Minister that in principle all the electronic health records of British patients will be available for qualified researchers. That's one extreme. At almost the same time, an effort in Holland to make the electronic medical records available to physicians across the whole network within the country was voted down. So they don't even, patients there or their representatives don't even want their records to be shared between physicians in the same country. So I think there is a time now for European regulations, and I'm not sure that I agree with the statement that patients own their data. In fact, in most European countries, the data have been paid for by and large by society. So I think patients have an obligation under a social contract to allow society to benefit from that investment without, of course, sacrificing the personal freedoms and the privacy that they're entitled to. So I'm not suggesting to diminish that, but simply to have a sort of situation like they have for organ donation, that in principle everyone is supposed to donate their organs unless they opt out of the system. If you had a similar rule for sharing one's electronic data files, I think that would go a long way in Europe towards making them available and getting over this problem of having to give informed consent, because I think that's going to be a very, very difficult road.
I can just share a very short comment from the point of IMI. I mean, it's in our mission really to foster sharing of data that will be produced by our project as much as possible. Only one thing we can say that, I mean, the point is the projects are still running and they are still quite early, and actually AMIF has started for 1 month. So I think that, I mean, it's definitely in our scope, but first we have to let the people do their work.
Sort of. So I kind of agree. I think we could be a bit stronger than that, though, Elisabetta. So I couldn't agree more with you, sir. I would love us to get to a stage where we make our data in effect open source like ADNI has done. It is difficult for all sorts of reasons, and the reasons are less to do with legal reasons and more to do with people reasons. You know, people invest their lives and their careers in getting this data, and they feel, you know, there's all that. But I learned a lesson about this. Let me tell you a personal story about this. So I told you about the AdNeuromed study. It's more or less the same sort of study as ADNI. ADNI did a lot more than we did in terms of some of the assessments, but that's a detail. It's more or less the same size, same kind of study. And I find myself speaking on the same sort of platform at a conference as Mike Weiner sometimes. Now, I'm quite proud of AdNeuromed. We've produced, I think it's something like 35 or 40 papers. That's pretty good for a single study. When Mike gives his talk, so I show my last slide of these 30 or 40 papers, and I'm feeling pretty proud. Then Mike Weiner comes up and shows ADNI, and he shows a rolling slide that carries on rolling for about 3 or 4 minutes of all of the papers, the hundreds and hundreds of papers that ADNI has produced. It is a fantastic illustration of the power of making your data open source. Because, as you suggest, all of the brains and the intelligence that could use AdNeuromed data isn't contained within AdNeuromed. It's in the world. And I think that's true for EMIF. So I'm an absolute advocate. I've bought into your idea. The sooner we can get there, the better. All I can say is, you know, there are some other reasons why that's difficult. But from my perspective, I'll try and get us to that. Your second point is desperately important. And you're quite right. In Europe, in some parts of Europe, including, I have to say, in the last month or two in the Parliament, there are some things moving forward and some things moving backwards in terms of the use of electronic health records data. And this is really important. It's really important not just for research, but for clinical practice and for the health of Europeans. We have to be safe with the data. We mustn't exploit the data inappropriately. We must respect patients and populations. However, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the future of research and the future of healthcare depends upon us being able to use this data for the health of our populations. And I think that needs all of us as individuals and our organizations to take this seriously, because we are not all moving forward at the same pace. There are some parts of Europe that are going in the reverse direction, and I'm deeply worried by that.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for now for one more question, and then since one of our panelists has to leave at 3:30 sharp, I encourage everybody to continue the discussion during the coffee break. So,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
Two more. So, Oscar from Pharmacog. I would like to be a little bit provocative, perhaps, since we're talking about which models are required for data sharing, and you just illustrated the impact it has had for ADNI. However, publications don't develop new drugs. You can have 1,000 new papers, and it will not warrant a new drug to the market. And I think one unique feature of IMI was to endorse methods and opportunities for new drugs to be developed and brought to the patient at the end of the day. And I think this deliverable is not concrete yet to the efforts that have been put in the initiative. I am a strong supporter of the consortia, but I think that what I haven't seen in discussion today is how you are engaging, I think, two important elements, which is a missing stakeholder here, professional organizations, and not only patients, but the clinical guidelines. If we don't change the clinical guidelines to actually implement those concepts, diagnosis, prevention, and treatment will remain as it is. So that's what's being done about that. Second, policies, not only in terms of what the criteria are for regulatory acceptance, but I see beyond that the need for a process. I have participated last year in the DIA meeting looking at geriatrics. So Alzheimer's is part of the concept of geriatrics, and how we can or need to implement a process by which we have the dialogue open with regulatory agencies about the content and the elements that fit into a development plan for drugs, similar to what has been done to the pediatric population, which changed the way we develop drugs for children. Something similar needs to be done. What are the consortia going to do about it?
Well, very quick answer.
Excellent points, Oscar, and I think your passion in modeling and simulation is what CMD has committed so much investment in. The whole idea of building this database and pooling to create the standard was around a goal of developing a clinical trial modeling and simulation tool, a really revolutionary approach to not continue to have patients be treated with unknown therapies without some really good rationale with data behind it to develop the best approach in terms of numbers of patients, duration of treatment, and designs that could be modeled, just like the aerospace industry does. They don't send everybody up into space first. And I think we did that years ago with the goal to deliver on the core elements of the Critical Path Initiative and how these drug development tools could be done way beyond a publication, which we have achieved, but get a regulatory decision that will put a stamp of approval so that any new company, any company designing a trial with that patient population in mind can use this tool to have more confidence that if their drug does not succeed, it's not due to a failed trial design. So I think, and Oscar, your passion for modeling and simulation is equal, and I think we need to apply these kind of innovative approaches more and more to show how we compress the timeline for drug development with these approaches.
Just to add a comment to Oscar's question about publications, obviously from a pharmacog point of view, that is an important deliverable. But for me personally, and I think most of the FPA partners, it's more about whether these models are accepted by the industry as being predictive and robust. You know, whether the transgenic models we're looking at are really doing what we think they're doing in terms of predicting efficacy, and whether some of these endpoints are really helping us to shorten the drug discovery timelines. For me, they're the major issues, far beyond any of the publications.
Wasn't this enough? Okay, I'm sorry, we have to wrap up now. I would like to thank you, everybody. Just say that I think very importantly, towards the end, the discussions become really interesting. I think also to start to see what are the gaps. And I think that really now we have all these people, all the group together, and I'm really looking forward to working all together to try to cover this gap. And thank you to everybody.